In Hollywood, there were fights everyone heard about. And then there were the ones no one ever talked about. The second kind were the most important. The parking lot behind the studio was nearly empty that evening. It was washed in a pale orange glow from the setting sun. Long shadows stretched across the cracked asphalt. A few cars remained, mostly older sedans, their chrome dulled by years of dust and heat. The lot had seen thousands of actors come and go, dreamers, stars, and men who carried more weight inside than the world ever noticed. Dean Martin stepped out first. He didn't rush. He never did. His jacket hung loosely on his shoulders, his tie slightly undone. His face relaxed in that familiar way people mistook for carelessness. To most of Hollywood, Dean Martin was charm, laughter, and a glass raised just high enough to keep everyone guessing. A man who made everything look easy. But that ease was a mask. And tonight the mask was thinner than usual. He paused beside his car, resting one hand on the roof, breathing in slowly. The day had been long, not physically, emotionally. The kind of day where words lingered longer than they should, where silences felt sharp, where a man walked away from a room knowing something had gone wrong but not knowing how to fix it behind him. Footsteps echoed, firm, controlled, purposeful. Kirk Douglas didn't announce himself. He never needed to. He crossed the parking lot with the posture of a man who had spent his life refusing to bend. His shoulders were squared, his jaw set, his eyes steady. Even after hours on set, even after decades in an unforgiving industry, there was something in him that stayed sharp, disciplined, alert. Dean turned. Slowly, their eyes met. The air between them felt tighter than it had all day. "You walk away real easy," Kirk said. His voice calm but edged. "Always have." Dean gave a faint smile. Not a mocking one. Not a friendly one either. Just enough to acknowledge the words without surrendering to them. "I don't see the point in hanging around once the work's done," Dean replied. "That's not what I mean," Kirk said. Silence followed. The kind that carried years inside it. They had known each other a long time. Long enough to recognize when a conversation wasn't really about the words being spoken. Long enough to know that what was coming had been building quietly, piece by piece, across rehearsals, glances, jokes that landed wrong, and respect that was never fully spoken. On set, the tension had been subtle, but present. Kirk had noticed at first how Dean deflected serious moments with humor, how he seemed to drift when others leaned in. To Kirk, who approached everything with intensity and preparation, it looked like indifference. To Dean, it felt like judgment. "I put everything into this," Kirk said, stepping closer. "Every role, every scene, every minute. And you treat it like it's all a joke." Dean's smile faded. "You think I don't care?" he asked quietly. Kirk didn't answer immediately. His eyes searched Dean's face, as if trying to find something beneath the surface that refused to show itself. "I think," Kirk said slowly, "that you hide behind charm so you don't have to explain yourself to anyone." The words landed harder than either man expected. Dean straightened. "You don't know a thing about me," he said. "I know what I see," Kirk replied. "And I'm tired of pretending it doesn't matter." The parking lot felt suddenly smaller. Dean took a step forward, closing the distance. Not aggressively, but deliberately. "You want to know why I joke?" Dean said. "Why? I keep things light." Kirk didn't flinch. "I want to know why you don't stand your ground." Dean laughed once, sharply. Funny coming from a man who's never backed down from anything in his life. "That's because I don't believe in backing down," Kirk said. "Especially from myself." That struck something. Dean looked away for a moment, toward the horizon where the sun was slipping behind the buildings. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "Not everyone fights the same way," he said. Kirk exhaled through his nose. "That sounds like an excuse." Dean turned back, his eyes steady now. "No," he said. "It sounds like someone who learned early on that surviving doesn't always mean swinging first." The silence that followed was different. Heavier. Kirk had grown up fighting against poverty, against expectations, against a world that demanded strength at every turn. To him, Resilience meant pushing forward no matter the cost. But Dean's words hinted at a different kind of endurance, one that didn't announce itself, one that stayed hidden. Still, pride doesn't dissolve easily. If you've got something to prove, Kirk said suddenly, prove it. Dean raised an eyebrow. How? Kirk gestured toward the empty space between the cars. Right here, he said. No cameras. No audience. Just to men. Dean stared at him. For a moment, it almost seemed like he might laugh it off. Like he might turn it into a joke, offer a quip, deflect the tension the way he always did. But he didn't. Instead, he slowly set his jacket on the hood of his car. You sure about this? Dean asked. Kirk nodded once. The challenge hung in the air not as violence, but as something deeper. A test of respect, of honesty, of the images they had built around themselves, too. Men who had spent their lives performing now stood in a place where there was no script. Dean loosened his tie and placed it beside his. Jacket, he said almost thoughtfully. This isn't going to end the way you think. Kirk's eyes narrowed slightly. Maybe not. But it'll end honest. They stepped into the open space, the asphalt cool beneath their shoes. No crowd, no noise. Just the distant hum of the city and the quiet weight of decades pressing in. Neither man raised his fists yet. They stood there, breathing, measuring, recognizing something unexpected in each other, and for the first time. The fight wasn't about anger. It was about being seen. What happened next, in that quiet parking lot, would never make headlines. But it would stay with both men for the rest of their lives. The silence stretched longer than either man expected. Not the awkward kind, the dangerous kind. Dean Martin stood with his hands loose at his sides, shoulders relaxed, posture almost casual, but something had shifted behind his eyes. The humor that usually softened his expression was gone. In its place was a stillness that made Kirk Douglas pause. For the first time since stepping into the open space between the cars, this wasn't the man Hollywood laughed with. This was someone else. Kirk noticed it immediately. He had spent his life reading opponents in screen, in business meetings, in rooms where power moved quietly. And right now, Dean wasn't performing. He was waiting. You always hesitate like that? Kirk asked. Dean tilted his head slightly. Only when something matters. That answer unsettled Kirk more than an insult would have. He stepped forward first, not fast, not reckless. A measured step, deliberate, controlled. His fists came up instinctively, the way they had when he was young and had to defend himself without thinking. Muscle memory took over. Dean didn't mirror him. Instead, he shifted his weight back half a step, eyes locked on Kirk's shoulders, not his fists. That detail didn't go unnoticed. You're watching the wrong thing, Kirk said. Dean shook his head once. No, I'm watching the truth. The first punch came quickly. Kirk didn't swing with rage. He never did. His strike was clean, direct, aimed to test, not to end. A probing blow meant to measure reaction. Dean moved. Not dramatically. Not impressively. He simply wasn't where the punch landed. The air snapped where his face had been. Kirk blinked. Dean countered not with a punch, but with a step inside the space, forcing Kirk to adjust to reset his footing. It was subtle, almost polite. You learned that where? Kirk asked, circling now. Dean didn't answer. The second exchange was faster. Kirk threw 2 strikes this time. Sharper, more committed. Dean blocked one with his forearm, absorbed the other against his shoulder, grunting softly as the impact traveled through muscle and bone. Pain. Flared, real pain. The kind Dean hadn't felt in years. For a moment, memory rushed in bars, backstage rooms, nights when words turned sharp and fists followed. A younger version of himself, less controlled, less careful. He pushed it down. This wasn't that. Kirk pressed forward, sensing momentum. You think smiling gets you out of everything, he said, breathing harder now. But it doesn't. Dean took a hit to the ribs. A solid one. The sound echoed faintly across the lot. Dean exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "No," he said. "It doesn't." And then he struck back, not wild, not angry, precise. His fist caught Kirk across the jaw, not hard enough to drop him, but clean enough to send a jolt through his head and a message through his spine. Kirk staggered one step. Shock flashed across his face, not because of the pain, because of the restraint. Dean hadn't followed through. He hadn't rushed. He hadn't taken advantage. He had chosen not to. They stood there, breathing heavily now, sweat forming at their temples, the tension thick and electric. "You could have finished that," Kirk said quietly. Dean wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "That's not what this is." Kirk laughed one short, sharp. "Then what is it?" Dean looked at him fully now. "It's you trying to prove I'm something I'm not," he said. "And me getting tired of letting people decide who I am?" It landed deeper than any punch. Kirk's jaw tightened, not from pain, but recognition. He had spent his entire life fighting against being underestimated, against being boxed in by expectations, against being told what he was allowed to be, and now standing across from him was a man who had fought the opposite battle against being oversimplified, dismissed as easy, shallow, answers. Two different wars, same exhaustion. They clashed again, harder this time. No words, just breath, impact, movement. Kirk's knuckles split slightly when he caught Dean's cheekbone. Dean tasted blood, metallic and sharp. He wiped it away without comment. Dean landed a blow to Kirk's shoulder, forcing a grunt from his chest. Kirk responded with a hook that caught Dean's temple, making the world tilt for a heartbeat. Neither man went down, neither wanted to. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Time blurred. Finally, Kirk stepped back. Raising a hand, "Enough," he said. Dean stopped immediately. They stood there, chests rising and falling, faces marked, pride bruised more than bodies. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Kirk surprised himself. "You weren't running," he said. "You were choosing." Dean nodded once. "Every time." Kirk leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. Catching his breath, "I thought you didn't care," he admitted. Dean leaned against a car, the metal cool against his back. "I care," he said. "I just don't need to bleed for an audience." The words sat between them heavy. Honest. Kirk straightened slowly. "All these years," he said, "I thought strength looked one way." Dean smiled faintly, not the public smile. Something quieter most people do. They didn't shake hands. They didn't apologize. They simply stood there, changed in ways neither fully understood. Yet what neither man realized, what couldn't be known yet, was that this wasn't the end of the confrontation. It was the beginning of something far more uncomfortable, because in the days that followed, bruises would fade. But the questions WOULDN, single quotes, and soon. One moment, one unexpected act would force both men to confront the truth they had spent their lives avoiding. The bruises were easy to explain. A careless door, a clumsy rehearsal, a long day that left the body slower than usual. Hollywood had always accepted simple answers, but sleep was another matter. That night, Dean Martin lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, the room lit only by a thin line of moonlight cutting through the curtains. The ache in his ribs pulsed quietly with every breath. Not unbearable. Just enough to remind him of something he couldn't push away. He rolled onto his side, then back again. Nothing helped. It wasn't the pain that kept him awake. It was the look on Kirk Douglas's face after that last exchange. Not anger, not defeat, recognition. Dean had seen that look before, on men who suddenly realized the story they'd been telling themselves no longer worked. He exhaled slowly and closed his eyes. But the parking lot came back instantly. The silence. The asphalt. The moment when the fight stopped being about fists and started being about truth. For most of his life, Dean had survived by being liked, not admired, not feared. Liked. It was safer that way. People laughed, relaxed, lowered their guard. They didn't ask hard questions. They didn't dig. They didn't expect him to explain why he kept certain walls intact. Charm gave him control without confrontation, but tonight, that armor had cracked across the city. Kirk Douglas sat at the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. A small cut on his knuckles had already scabbed, but he kept staring at it as if it belonged to someone else. He had lost fights before on screen, in negotiations, in public opinion, but this felt different. Because tonight, he hadn't lost to a weaker man. He had lost to an idea he didn't understand. For decades, Kirk had believed in forced discipline, pressure, refusal to yield. His life had been a constant uphill push against poverty, prejudice, and the quiet assumption that he didn't belong. Strength to him had always meant endurance in full view of the world, and then there was Dean, effortless, smiling, unbothered. Or, so Kirk had thought. The realization unsettled him. Dean hadn't fought like a man trying to prove dominance. He hadn't chased victory. He hadn't even seemed interested in winning. He had fought, like someone who knew exactly who he admitted. Wazin didn't need permission to be that person. Kirk stood and paced the room. That kind of confidence was dangerous, not because it threatened others, but because it exposed them. For the first time in years, Kirk wondered whether his intensity had been less about purpose and more about fear. Fear of slowing down. Fear of being overlooked. Fear that if he ever stopped pushing, he'd disappear. Back in his apartment, Dean finally sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He pressed a hand against his ribs and winced slightly. He laughed under his breath. "So this is what honesty costs," he murmured. Memories surfaced ones he usually kept buried. Childhood rooms filled with shouting. Nights where humor was the only way to survive tension. Learning early that if you could make people smile, they wouldn't look too closely at your wounds. He had never told Kirk any of that. He hadn't told anyone. And yet, somehow, in a parking lot with no audience, Kirk had come closer to seeing him than most people ever had. That scared him. The next morning, the studio buzzed as usual. Lights, scripts, assistants moving fast. Pretending not to notice anything unusual. But people noticed. Dean walked in with a faint bruise near his cheekbone, partially hidden by makeup that didn't quite do its job. Kirk arrived later, jaw tight, hands bandaged under the excuse of a minor accident. Their eyes met across the set. No smiles. No nods. Just a long, steady look. The crew felt it immediately. Something unspoken had shifted. The air carried tension, not hostile, but charged, like a storm that had already passed, leaving everything sharper, cleaner, and more fragile. During a break, Kirk found himself watching Dean from a distance. Dean joked with a grip, laughed with a writer, but there was a new edge to him now, a restraint, as if something had been set aside, making Kirk realize something unsettling. Dean wasn't hiding anymore. He was choosing when to engage. That afternoon, a scene went wrong. A line missed. A cue delayed. Normally, Kirk would have corrected it immediately, firm, direct, unyielding. But this time he hesitated. Dean noticed. Their eyes met again, in that silent exchange. Kirk did something he hadn't done in years. He softened. "Let's take it again," Kirk said calmly. "No rush." The room relaxed. Dean raised an eyebrow slightly, surprised, but said nothing. Later, as the sun dipped low and the set began to empty, Kirk approached Dean near the edge of the stage. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Kirk said quietly, "I owe you something." Dean looked at him. "You don't owe me a win or a loss." Kirk shook his head. "No, I owe you respect." Dean studied him carefully, as if deciding whether this was real. "Careful," Dean said softly. "That changes things." Kirk nodded. "I know." They stood there. Two men who had built entire identities on strength now, standing at the edge of something. Unfamiliar. Vulnerability. Neither of them realized yet that this was only the beginning, because the real test wasn't the fight, it was what came next, and soon. A single decision made away from cameras, contracts, and applause would force both men to choose between who they had been and who they were finally ready to become. The invitation came quietly, no assistant, no formal note, no studio logo at the top of the page, just a short message, delivered by hand, folded once, written in a firm but careful script. Dinner, no crowd, no stories, just honesty. It was signed by Kirk Douglas. When Dean Martin read it, he didn't smile. He didn't joke. He didn't brush it off the way he once would have. He read it twice. Then he nodded to himself, as if agreeing to something that had been decided long before the paper ever reached him. The restaurant sat above the city, tucked away where tourists never wandered. No photographers, no velvet ropes, just dim lighting, polished wood, the quiet hum of conversation kept deliberately low. Kirk arrived early. He sat straight-backed, hands folded, eyes occasionally drifting toward the window. The city lights below looked distant, unreal, like a backdrop painted to impress, not to reveal. Dean arrived 10 minutes later. No entourage, no showmanship. He took off his jacket and hung it neatly on the back of the chair before sitting down. That alone told Kirk everything. They ordered simply, no wine, no indulgence. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then Kirk spoke. "I've spent my life believing pressure makes people honest," he said. "That if you push hard enough, the truth comes out." Dean looked at him calmly. "Sometimes it does, and sometimes," Kirk asked. Dean met his eyes. "Sometimes people just learn how to bleed quietly." That answer landed like a weight set gently but firmly on the table. Kirk leaned back in his chair. "I misjudged you," he said. Not defensively. Not apologetically. Just plainly. Dean didn't respond right away. "You didn't," he said at last. "You judged what I showed." Kirk nodded slowly. "And what you showed was?" "Controlled." Dean exhaled. "Control is survival when chaos teaches you early." Kirk's fingers tightened together. For the first time, he didn't interrupt. He didn't challenge. He listened. Dean didn't tell stories meant to impress. He didn't dramatize. He didn't confess everything. He spoke carefully, selectively, about learning humor as armor, about being underestimated and letting it happen, about how strength doesn't always look loud. Kirk listened like a man relearning language. "I thought restraint was avoidance," Kirk said finally. Dean shook his head. "Restraint is choosing where you spend yourself." That was the moment, not the fight, not the bruises, not the parking lot. This Kirk realized something then that unsettled him more than any punch ever had. His relentless drive, his refusal to soften, slow down, or yield had protected him. But it had also isolated him. He had mistaken endurance for invulnerability. He had demanded from others what he demanded from himself, never questioning the cost. Kirk said quietly. "I thought I was teaching people how to be strong." Dean smiled faintly. "Maybe you were. Just not the only way." They ate in silence after that, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Two men measuring their pasts with new tools. When they stood to leave, Kirk extended his hand. Dean looked at it for a long moment. Then he took it. The handshake wasn't firm. It wasn't symbolic. It was human. The weeks that followed didn't bring headlines. No interviews spoke of reconciliation. No stories leaked about changed men. Hollywood moved on, as it always did. But something was different. Kirk became quieter on set. Still disciplined, but now he asked instead of commanded. He listened before correcting. And when pressure arose, he paused. Dean became more present. Still charming, but no longer hiding behind it. He spoke up when something mattered. He stopped letting silence carry the wrong message. Neither man announced the change. They lived it years later. When both had aged, when fame had softened into legacy, they crossed paths again, older, slower, but steadier. Kirk smiled first. Dean returned it. Nothing needed to be said, because the real victory had never been the fight. It was the understanding that strength wears many faces, and the quiet ones often last the longest. What happened in that parking lot didn't make them legends. It made them better men, and that far more than applause was what changed them forever.